The desert stretched wide and merciless, its sands shimmering like molten gold beneath the unforgiving Sunday. Margaret Lane, a cowgirl hardened by loss and solitude, rode slowly across the barren flats. Her horse, Buckshot, limped heavily, one hind leg torn by a jagged rock days earlier. She had tried to rest him, to let the wound knit, but he refused to stay behind. He carried her still, even while stumbling. Margaret stroked his sweat-darkened neck. "Easy, boy," she murmured. The desert offered no mercy, and water was nearly gone. Yet Buckshot kept pulling her toward some unseen destination. Margaret's canteen sloshed, with only a swallow left. She had rationed carefully, but the desert devoured strength faster than she could measure. Every ridge looked the same, every horizon blurred by heat. She thought of turning back, of surrendering to the dry wind and endless dust, but Buckshot's ears flicked forward, his eyes fixed on something ahead. He limped on, determined. "What do you see, old friend?" Margaret whispered, clinging to the thin thread of hope his stride suggested. If not for his will, she would have already laid down beneath the sun and let the sand claim her bones. The desert tested her resolve with each passing hour. Buzzards circled high, shadows gliding across the sand like omens. Margaret remembered her father's stories of lost wanderers, bones bleaching beneath the sky, their names erased by silence. She refused to join them. The leather of her hat brim cracked with heat, her shirt clung with sweat, and her boots filled with sand at every step. She considered mercy for Buckshot, ending his suffering before coyotes found him, but the look in his eyes silenced that thought. Determination burned in them still. He knew a path she could not yet see. Night finally draped the desert, a blanket of stars stretched across eternity. Margaret dismounted, her legs trembling with exhaustion, and collapsed beside her horse. The air cooled sharply, the desert's cruel trick. Buckshot lowered his head, nuzzling her shoulder, urging her to rise. She laid her hand against his jaw. "You've got more faith than I do." She slept in fits, waking to coyotes yipping across the flats, their voices carrying like a choir of ghosts. Buckshot stood watch, injured but unbowed, as if some ancient instinct guided him. When dawn spilled across the sand, he tugged her onward again. By the second day without water, Margaret's lips cracked and her vision blurred. Heat shimmered, twisting the air into cruel mirages. She thought she saw trees, rivers, even faces long gone. But Buckshot moved steadily, each step measured, his ears tuned to something distant. Margaret leaned low over the saddle horn, too weak to question him. She let him lead, trusting his senses more than her fading strength. Each jolt of his stride sent pain up her spine, but she clung to the saddle horn. "Find it, boy," she croaked. "If there's anything out here worth finding, it's yours." Late that afternoon, the desert changed. Margaret noticed first a shift in the wind cooler, carrying a trace of moisture. Then the sand gave way to patches of stone, streaked with mineral veins. Buckshot snorted, ears pricked, pace quickening despite his wound. Margaret lifted her head, eyes straining. On the horizon, cliffs rose jagged and improbable, like the spine of some ancient beast. She blinked through haze. Between the cliffs shimmered green, faint but undeniable. Her heart pounded. Could it be real? She slapped her cheeks, certain it was another trick of thirst. But Buckshot nickered and pressed forward, sure and steady. As they neared, the green resolved into scrub, then shrubs, then honest trees clinging to life along stone. Margaret wept, tears cutting through the dust on her face. Buckshot picked up speed, stumbling but refusing to stop. The air grew cooler, richer, filled with the whisper of leaves. For the first time in days, she smelled water, not the phantom scent of mirages, but the unmistakable freshness of life. A hidden valley yawned before them, shielded by cliffs, invisible from the flats. Margaret swayed in the saddle, nearly falling. Buckshot carried her straight toward it, as though following a map written in instinct. They reached a narrow trail that twisted between boulders, the stone radiating heat like an oven. Margaret clung to the saddle as Buckshot limped upward, hooves striking sparks against rock. Coyotes yipped behind them, drawn by the scent of weakness, but the cliffs cut off their path. Margaret twisted in the saddle, rifle ready, but the predators did not follow. The trail curved suddenly, and before her eyes opened a vision she never thought she would see. Green grass spread like a carpet, a ribbon of water shimmered, and in the distance, white spray rose from a waterfall, an oasis. Margaret dismounted slowly, her knees buckling, and collapsed in the grass. She pressed her face to the damp earth, drinking its coolness like salvation. Buckshot staggered beside her, trembling with exhaustion, but lowered his muzzle into the stream. The sound of him drinking filled her with gratitude deeper than words. She cupped water in her hands, the taste pure and sweet, the best she had ever known. "You did it," she whispered hoarsely, tears mixing with the stream. "You saved us both." Buckshot lifted his head, droplets cascading from his lips, eyes soft but bright with unbroken resolve. The waterfall thundered in the distance, its spray rising like smoke against the cliffs. Margaret crawled closer, every bone aching, and let the mist cool her face. Ferns and wildflowers grew thick around the pool at its base, their colors dazzling after so much sand. Birds wheeled overhead, flashes of blue and red against the rock. She laughed, the sound raw but genuine. She had walked through hell, and somehow heaven had been waiting behind stone walls. Buckshot stood nearby, his wounds still raw but less angry now that he had drunk his fill. "Rest, old boy," she murmured. Exploring further, Margaret found something she did not expect. A path, faint but deliberate, leading away from the pool. The earth bore signs of old-use rocks cleared, faint ruts of wheels, long gone. Curiosity tugged at her despite exhaustion. She followed the trail, Buckshot limping faithfully behind. Not far from the falls, half hidden by trees, stood the skeleton of a house. Weathered wood leaned against itself, windows dark. The roof collapsed in places. Vines crept up the walls, claiming it inch by inch. Margaret stopped, heart thudding. Someone had lived here once, carved life into this secret valley. The cabin told stories in silence. A rusted stove sagged in one corner, its iron belly cracked. A chair, long broken, lay half buried in moss. Bird nests filled the rafters. Yet despite decay, Margaret felt warmth in the place, as though echoes of laughter still clung to the timbers. She stepped inside, fingers brushing the frame. "Whoever you were," she whispered, "you found paradise." Buckshot nosed at the doorway, hesitant but curious. Margaret sank into the mossy floorboards, overwhelmed. The desert had tried to claim her life, but fate, or perhaps Buckshot, had led her to a hidden sanctuary. Night came soft and fragrant in the valley. Crickets sang, frogs croaked in the stream, and the air smelled of flowers instead of dust. Margaret built a small fire near the cabin, its light flickering against the ruined walls. Buckshot grazed close, ears twitching, finally at peace. Margaret leaned back against a stone, belly full of clean water, and felt gratitude spill through her. She was alive. More than that, she had been given a place where life still thrived. The loneliness that had weighed on her shoulders lifted slightly. The valley welcomed her as though she belonged here. As she watched the stars emerge above the cliffs, Margaret wondered about the people who had once lived in the cabin. Pioneers chasing land, outlaws hiding from law, or perhaps just dreamers who stumbled upon the same miracle. She could almost hear laughter on the breeze, smell stew simmering on the stove that now lay broken. The thought comforted her rather than frightening her. This place was not haunted, it was blessed. Buckshot limped over and lowered himself beside her. his warm bulk steady against her side. She laid a hand on his shoulder. "We'll start again here," she promised. The following morning, Margaret awoke to birdsong. Sunlight streamed through branches, painting the valley gold. She stretched, body aching but renewed, and filled her canteen from the stream. Buckshot's wound looked cleaner, the swelling reduced, as if even he healed faster in this place. She tore strips from her shirt to bind it, humming softly. "You saved me, and I'll save you." For the first time in years, she felt purpose beyond survival. This valley could be more than refuge, it could be home. She rose and studied the cabin, imagining walls mended, smoke curling from the chimney once more. Margaret spent the day exploring. She found wild berries in the thickets, their juice staining her fingers. Rabbits darted through underbrush, deer trails wound along the cliffs. The waterfall's roar never ceased, a heartbeat for the valley. She discovered stone foundations near the cabin, perhaps a barn or corral long gone. Grass grew thick, perfect for grazing. She smiled, imagining Buckshot fattened and strong again. The desert outside seemed like another world, distant and cruel. Here, life was abundant, generous. She whispered a prayer of thanks to the land, to fate, and most of all to the horse that had led her. That night, Margaret lit another fire and cooked what little beans she carried. She ate slowly, savoring the meal as though it were a feast. Buckshot stood nearby, content, his ears flicking lazily. She leaned back and studied the stars framed by cliffs. Her father had once told her that the West broke the weak and tested the strong, but sometimes, just sometimes, it rewarded those who refused to give up. She smiled softly. Perhaps this valley was her reward, her chance to rebuild, to carve meaning from loneliness. The cabin's shadow behind her felt less like ruin and more like invitation. Days passed, and Margaret worked. She cleared vines from the cabin walls, patched holes with scavenged wood, and swept years of dust from the floor. The place began to resemble shelter rather than ruin. She carved her initials into the doorway, a quiet claim. Buckshot's wound healed slowly but surely. Soon he walked without limp, tail swishing with renewed energy. She built him a rough corral near the stream, laughing when he escaped it easily to graze wherever he pleased. Each task stitched her more tightly to the valley, weaving her into its hidden rhythm of survival and renewal. Yet Margaret knew the valley's secrecy was its greatest treasure. No one must discover it, not McCrae's men, not desperate settlers, not thieves. She resolved to guard its secret fiercely. When she rode beyond the cliffs to trade in town weeks later, she told no one of her find. She returned quickly, heart soaring as the valley welcomed her again. It felt like stepping from one world into another, from hardship to abundance, from loneliness to quiet belonging. She whispered to Buckshot, "This is ours, and no one can take it." His answering nicker felt like an oath spoken in stone. On the 20th day since Buckshot had first limped into the valley, Margaret stood at the waterfall's base, spray dampening her face. She thought of the desert beyond, of all she had endured, and of the moment she nearly gave up. Buckshot had saved her, leading her to life when she could not see it herself. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her cheek to his coat. "You're more than my horse," she whispered. "You're my compass, my family, my miracle." Together, they gazed at the valley, the hidden oasis, the cabin, the thriving green, and knew they were home. Life in the valley quickly shaped itself into a rhythm. Margaret Lane woke each morning to the murmur of the stream and the crash of the waterfall echoing off the cliffs. She rose stiff from her blanket, splashed her face with cold water, and tended to Buckshot's wound. The gash had begun to heal, and each day he put more weight on the leg. The desert outside felt like a dream she had escaped, a nightmare already fading. Here, air carried the smell of wet grass, and every dawn whispered promise. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to hope. While exploring near the stream, Margaret discovered a peach tree half hidden behind thickets. Its branches bent heavy with fruit, small but sweet. Her laughter startled the birds when she bit into one, juice running down her chin. She gathered more, filling her skirt, and carried them back to the cabin. For months she had scraped by on beans and jerky. Now she feasted like a queen. That evening, she set a peach on the cabin's threshold in thanks. "This valley is a gift," she whispered. The cliff said nothing, but the leaves rustled as if agreeing. For once, she felt blessed. Buckshot grew stronger with each passing week. He galloped short distances now, kicking playfully at shadows. Margaret brushed his coat until it gleamed like polished copper. She often pressed her cheek against his neck, whispering, "You brought me here. You're the reason I'm alive." The bond between them deepened beyond words. Still, she knew she was not the valley's first guest. Old tools rusted in the grass, fence posts half buried by moss. Whoever had lived here had left long ago, but their presence lingered in the cabin's bones. Margaret felt herself stepping into their story, carrying it forward with reverence. One evening, storm clouds stacked like mountains over the cliffs. Margaret hurried to patch the cabin roof, tying canvas against leaks. Buckshot sheltered under the rocks while thunder cracked and rain poured in torrents. The stream swelled, roaring with new fury, yet Margaret only laughed. In the desert, rain was rare and cruel. Here, it was abundance, drenching the orchard, feeding the soil. She spread her arms and let it soak her, feeling reborn. Buckshot nickered, shaking water from his mane. "We made it, old friend," she shouted over the storm. "We found the one place the desert can't reach." When the storm cleared, the valley transformed. Wildflowers exploded across the grass in yellow and purple. Margaret wove them into Buckshot's mane, laughing at his patient endurance. She laid a bundle on the cabin doorstep, in tribute to those who had lived here before. "Thank you," she whispered into the night. The fire crackled behind her. The waterfall roared, and for once her heart felt light. She no longer feared waking to nothing but dust. She had shelter, water, and food. For the first time in years, she believed she could belong somewhere again. She had finally found home. Still, fear lingered at the edges. Climbing the cliffs one afternoon, Margaret spotted tiny riders crossing the horizon, dust trailing behind them. Her chest tightened. If they found the narrow pass, her valley would be lost. She hurried down, dragging brush across the trailhead, piling stones to disguise the path. Buckshot watched, head high, ears twitching. Margaret stroked his muzzle. "This is ours. No one else can know." That night she sat awake, rifle across her lap, staring into the dark. Paradise was fragile. She vowed to defend it with her life, if necessary. The valley would not be taken. The cabin, once broken, began to change under her hands. She patched walls with scavenged planks, mended the roof with bark and stone, and coaxed the old stove back to life. Smoke curled from the chimney again. One night she sat at the rough table, eating beans and fresh peaches, Buckshot grazing outside, and felt whole. Not rich, not safe from every danger, but alive. She raised her tin cup in a private toast. To second chances, the waterfall's endless song seemed to answer, and she realized that loneliness, while heavy, had given her this gift. She would never squander it. Margaret planted seeds Jensen had once pressed into her hands: corn, beans, squash. She worked the soil with a rusted hoe from the ruins. To her amazement, green shoots broke through within days, delicate and stubborn. She knelt, tears in her eyes. "Grow strong," she whispered. These plants were more than food. They were a promise that the valley would carry her through the seasons. She checked them daily, pulling weeds, humming old songs her mother had sung. Buckshot grazed nearby, lifting his head as though approving. Together they watched hope grow inch by inch, row by row, heart by heart. Her exploration revealed caves behind the waterfall. One dripped steadily into a crystal pool, so pure it tasted of stone and sky. Another bore blackened walls, old fire pits carved into rock. Someone had lived here long before. Margaret touched the soot and felt kinship with the forgotten souls. Had they too fled the desert, seeking life? Had they found peace? She wondered if they had left willingly or been driven away. The thought stirred both gratitude and caution. This valley was both refuge and responsibility. She had inherited it, not owned it. She vowed to guard it fiercely. Danger reminded her that paradise was never perfect. Once, while gathering wood, she nearly stepped on a rattlesnake coiled in the grass. Its strike glanced her boot before Buckshot lunged, hooves flashing, driving it off. Margaret collapsed, shaking with adrenaline, clutching her horse's mane. "You've saved me twice over," she whispered. The valley sheltered her, but it also demanded respect. She built a stronger door, stacked firewood high, and kept her rifle near. Each night the firelight felt warmer, safer, as though the cabin itself had accepted her. She realized she was no longer a trespasser. She was part of its story. The months passed, and Margaret learned the valley's secrets. She knew where berries ripened, where deer crossed at dusk, where the stream ran deepest. She pruned the orchard, tended her crops, and filled jars with food. She stored peaches and corn, stacked wood for winter. Buckshot's coat gleamed, his body strong again. Looking at him, she whispered, "We've built something, haven't we?" Each task stitched her tighter to the land, binding her not with chains but with belonging. She had come from dust and despair, and now she held abundance in her hands. The valley had become her salvation. Yet loneliness sometimes crept in like a shadow. At night, Margaret sat by the fire, staring at the cabin walls, wishing for a voice besides her own. She spoke to Buckshot, telling him stories of her childhood, her parents, her dreams. He listened with calm eyes, ears flicking at her words. "You're my family now," she murmured, pressing her cheek against his neck. The bond was more than rider and horse. It was survival, companionship, and love. In his steady presence, she felt less alone. The valley had given her food and water. Buckshot had given her reason to live. From the cliffs, she often looked out over the desert. Beyond lay emptiness cruel and vast, yet powerless against the green heart she now guarded. She thought of the desperate wanderers still out there, searching for hope, and wondered if she should share her secret. But greed would destroy this place. The valley's gift was life, and life could be stolen. She whispered into the wind, "This is ours." The cliffs echoed her words faintly, sealing them like a vow. Margaret swore she would guard the valley's secret until her last breath. It was the only way to keep it safe. The first winter came gently. Snow dusted the cliffs, but the orchard stood strong, the stream flowed, and her stores filled the shelves. Margaret huddled by the stove, wrapped in blankets, listening to the storm howl outside. Buckshot's breath steamed in the cold, but he stayed warm in the corral she had built. For the first time, she did not fear hunger or freezing. She felt protected, sheltered by the valley itself. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Paradise was not free. It had cost her struggle, tears, and loss. But she had earned it, and she would honor it. Spring brought renewal. Blossoms burst across the orchard, the garden sprouted, and the valley hummed with life. Margaret walked barefoot through the grass, laughing as Buckshot frisked beside her like a colt. She splashed her face in the stream, tilted her head back to the sky, and shouted her gratitude. She had thought her story would end in the desert, her bones lost to sand. Instead, she had found joy again, unexpected and abundant. She pressed her palm to the cabin's doorframe and whispered, "I belong here." The cliffs, the waterfall, the orchard, they all seemed to agree. She was home, But peace was fragile. One day, while scouting the trailhead, Margaret found fresh boot prints. Panic surged. Someone had come dangerously close. She dragged branches across the path, camouflaged the stones, and climbed the cliffs to scan the desert. No riders appeared. But her heart would not settle. She returned to Buckshot, pressing her face into his mane. "If they find us, we'll fight," she promised. That night, she oiled her rifle and sat by the fire with her knife at hand. The valley was her treasure, her miracle, and she would defend it even if it meant blood. The days that followed passed without sign of intruders. Yet Margaret remained vigilant. She checked the cliffs, walked the orchard, and listened for strange sounds. Fear still gnawed, but each morning the valley greeted her with blossoms, birdsong, and flowing water. She forced herself to trust it, to breathe deeply and live. Buckshot grazed calmly, unconcerned. His peace steadied her. "If you're not afraid, maybe I shouldn't be," she murmured, stroking his neck. Slowly, the tightness in her chest eased. Perhaps the valley could protect itself. After all, it had survived long before she arrived. She was merely its guardian. Seasons turned. Margaret's body grew strong, her hands calloused from work. She built new walls, expanded the garden, and pressed cider from peaches. She learned to tan hides, to weave baskets, to live fully by the rhythm of the land. Buckshot grew older, but remained steady, his loyalty unshaken. Their bond deepened with each year, a partnership forged in desperation and tempered in peace. Together, they turned tragedy into blessing. Margaret had come here broken and weary, but now she was alive, thriving. She realized the valley had not only saved her life, it had given her a new one. One evening, Margaret sat at the base of the waterfall, her feet in the cold pool. She thought of the girl who had stumbled half dead through the desert, ready to surrender. She no longer recognized that woman. Buckshot nudged her shoulder, nearly knocking her into the water, and she laughed, splashing him playfully. Her laughter echoed against the cliffs, blending with the roar of the falls. It felt unburdened, genuine. She understood then the valley had not just given her survival, but joy. And joy, she realized, was rarer than gold, more precious than any land baron's riches. She finally felt free. At night, lying in the cabin, firelight dancing on the walls, Margaret whispered her truth. "This valley saved me. You saved me, Buckshot." The horse shifted outside, his steady presence a comfort. She closed her eyes, listening to the stream, the orchard, the endless waterfall. Life surrounded her, abundant and generous. She knew she would grow old here, that her story would end not in loneliness, but in belonging. The desert had tried to break her, but she had found sanctuary. Her laughter, carried on the wind, would echo through the cliffs for generations. Margaret Lane had finally found home.